Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined again this week by independent journalist Barry Malone. He's worked as an editor at Al Jazeera, a Reuters correspondent in Africa and the Middle East. Now writes the newsletter on Substack called Proximities. Welcome back. How are you doing?
Hi, Michael. Yeah, good. I could do without such a soggy day in London, but otherwise, well, yeah, thanks for having me back.
No, pleasure having you on. We mentioned last week we're going to try and make it a tradition when we get Barry on, because his Substack Proximities is about international stories which are undercovered. And we are, when we get him on, going to try and sort of cover one each show. So today we're going to talk about a potential war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And we're talking about some of the context there. And Barry has lived in Ethiopia for 5 years and covered the region extensively. So that will be really, really interesting. Also tonight, we'll be discussing Xi Jinping showing off the strength of China's armed forces with a massive military parade in Beijing. Ed Balls, someone of slightly lower world historical importance, has grilled Green Party leader Zack Polanski on Good Morning Britain. And Graham Linehan has been ordered to stop tweeting following his arrest by the Metropolitan Police. In a way, that's a gift. People pay for applications that stop them tweeting, and he's got it for free from the Met. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. As ever, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat, or you can tweet us on the hashtag NovaraLive. Our first story is about Angela Rayner, because the Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner has today admitted underpaying £40,000 in stamp duty, and she blamed poor legal advice.
I relied on that legal advice that I received that said that I was liable to pay the standard stamp duty. Subsequently to that, with all of the media reports that have been coming out, I took expert counsel advice on all of my affairs to ensure that everything was done proper. And that expert counsel said that the advice that I received was inaccurate, right, because of the trust. I don't own the property, that is true. I only own one property that is mortgaged, like most people. But because of the nature of the trust that was set up by the court, that I would be liable to pay the additional stamp duty. As soon as I knew that that was the case, I have alerted and referred myself to the independent advisor on the ministerial code to ensure that they can look transparently at what's happened, and also contacted HMRC to say that there is additional tax owing on this, and that I'm prepared to pay that and fully comply with the HMRC as well.
Underpaying tax because of bad legal advice is something, or supposedly because of bad legal advice, I suppose, is usually something I have little sympathy for. You generally have to be relatively well off to get legal advice on how much tax you have to pay. And most of the time when people are seeking legal advice on tax, it's how to minimize their tax. Most ordinary people don't get the chance. They just pay PAYE or whatever. I think the case here, though, is actually genuinely complicated. So the potential scandal was first dug up by The Telegraph, where they described Angela Rayner's situation like this. So this was on the weekend. So they said Rayner saved £40,000 in stamp duty on her new seaside flat after telling tax authorities it was her main home. The Telegraph can disclose. The Deputy Prime Minister is understood to have removed her name from the deeds of her house in Greater Manchester a few weeks before buying an £800,000 seaside flat in Hove, East Sussex. The changes enabled Miss Rayner to avoid paying £70,000 in stamp duty, which would have been applicable if Hove was her second home. Instead, she is thought to have paid £30,000 in stamp duty, saving her £40,000 in the process, because you pay higher stamp duty if it's your second home. Quite rightly, I suppose. She has also told Thameside Council in Manchester that her constituency house remains her primary residence, and informed Brighton and Hove Council that her apartment there was a second home for council tax purposes. They say, although the changes are entirely legal, the arrangements will raise questions over whether she has deliberately conducted her property affairs to pay less stamp duty and council tax. Now, explained like that, Rayner's situation does raise obvious questions. For example, why does she need two houses in the first place, especially if she's got a grace and favour property in London while she's Deputy Prime Minister? That makes three. Another question, why did she remove her name from the house she said was her main address in Greater Manchester, where she is a constituent MP? Was that claim so she could claim her Brighton flat wasn't in fact a second home, and therefore avoid a higher rate of stamp duty? Now, that all seems plausible. I'm sure people do that kind of thing. They fiddle with which is their first property, which is their second property, to minimize paying tax. Maybe she did do that. it does seem like there is some context here that makes it sound like maybe something more reasonable went on. So Angela Rayner put out a fairly long statement. I'm actually going to read a fair amount of it because I think the details are important, but this isn't the entire statement, don't worry. So Angela Rayner said, in 2023, my ex-husband and I divorced. To provide maximum stability during this transition, we agreed to a nesting arrangement where the children remain in the family home full-time while we alternate living there. A court-instructed trust was established in 2020 following a deeply personal and distressing incident involving my son as a premature baby. He was left with lifelong disabilities, and the trust was established to manage the award on his behalf, a standard practice in circumstances like ours. And so I suppose I'm going to keep sort of reading more of the statement, but to me that does seem to sort of start to explain why does she have a trust in the first place? Because obviously this idea that you've got a trust, that sort of gives tax avoidance, doesn't it? It makes it seem like that's what you're trying to do. But it does make sense if that's a revelation there that we didn't know before. But it seems as if she's got a child who has severe learning difficulties, and presumably if there was an award involved, there was some kind of negligence from the NHS. That's what you would imagine. So that explains the existence of the trust. The fact that it's ambiguous which is her main home, and she's given sort of slightly different accounts to different people, again, that makes some sense if there is a home which she and her partner share at different times while the child stays there full time. I know that's an arrangement that lots of people make, sort of if they're co-parenting or if they've broken up, they say, well, we don't want the child to move between the houses. So the house will be the child's house and we'll move between the house and somewhere else. Let's go on to the next bit. So she says, to ensure he continued to have stability in the family home, which had been adapted for his needs, we agreed that our interest in the family home would be transferred to this court-instructed trust, of which he is the sole beneficiary. Some of the interest in our family home was transferred to the trust in 2023. In January 2025, I sold the remaining interest in the property to my son's trust. This will give him the security of knowing the home is his, allowing him to continue to live in the home he feels safe in and grew up in. We transferred the property because it was in the best interest of our child. I acted as any parent would. Again, why did she sell it at that point? Was it to not pay the tax, or was it because she wanted a bit of extra money to buy a different property because she no longer owned a property because it had been transferred to her son? Unclear, but I think there's enough. It's possible to give her the benefit of the doubt there. Let's go on. She says, the sale of the property in Ashton-under-Lyme to the trust has not altered my family life. It remains my family home as it has been for over a decade. It is where my children live and have gone to school and now college, and where I regularly live while caring for them. After I sold my stake to the trust, I bought a property in Hove in May 2025. Like many people, I used the lump sum from selling my stake in my Ashton home, which was the only property I owned, and where my savings were for the deposit on my new one. I obtained a mortgage to finance the rest. So again, using the lump sum in that house, which she no longer owns, to buy a flat in Brighton. I think she's seeing Sam Tarry. I think he lives there. So I think maybe they live in that flat together. I'm not sure. But if you've broken up with your partner, you've got a new partner. Doesn't seem entirely unreasonable to buy a new flat if you have the means to do so. And then this is the final part of her explanation, which we're going to read to you. So she says, when purchasing the property, my understanding on advice from lawyers was that my circumstances meant I was liable for the standard rate of stamp duty. However, given the recent allegations in the press, I have subsequently sought further advice from a leading tax counsel to review that position and to ensure I am fully compliant with all tax provisions. I have now been advised that although I did not own any other property at the time of the purchase, the application of complex deeming provisions which relate to my son's trust gives rise to additional stamp duty liabilities. Now, again, obviously, as I said at the beginning, I'm not normally sympathetic to people who say, oh, well, I would have paid more tax, but I got bad legal advice. Normally when people get tax advice, they want to hear how they minimize their taxes. Maybe that's what Angela Rayner did. It is also plausible that this was a very complicated situation. It sounds like a very complicated situation. And she just asked the lawyer, what am I supposed to do? And the lawyer told her that. And she said, okay, I'm a busy person, whatever. There's obviously a cynical reading of this. And I'm not to say that it's bad to read the cynical. There's obviously a sort of negative reading of this and an understanding reading of this. I'm somewhat inclined to say there is enough there are enough complicating factors here that I'm happy to give her the benefit of the doubt. Tory leader Kemi Badenoch, though, thinks she should resign.
I remember when the Prime Minister said that tax evasion is a criminal offence and should be treated as all other fraud. If he had a backbone, he would sack her.
Reform's Richard Tice also thinks she should quit.
If she had any integrity, any moral decency, given her position as Deputy Prime Minister, she would offer her resignation to the Prime Minister.
Barry, I think this is maybe a bit all over the top, sort of on the top of all the news websites today. Obviously, it looks bad, but I do kind of think there is enough complicating detail here for me to think I'm going to withhold any particular strong judgment. But maybe I am being overly understanding of one of the most powerful people in the country.
I kind of agree with you. And, that might be a little bit boring because it's probably better if I disagreed and we had a ding dong. But it's clearly a very complicated situation that she has found herself in. And I think you're right that she has a complex home life. However, there are a couple of things that you said there that give me pause. Getting a lawyer to give you advice on tax, again, that's not something, as you said, that ordinary sort of normal people do. I think when you get a lawyer to give you tax advice that they're going to try and find ways for you not to pay that tax. But, look, even if she has a complicated family life and there is a justifiable reason for this, at the end of the day, she's the housing minister and the deputy prime minister. So for me, it's a question of judgment. How on earth do you get yourself into this position? And it's not the first time Angela Rayner has had an issue like this. And then to add to that, the fact that for years, Angela Rayner was the person who spoke out about Tory corruption and Tory sleaze. This was sort of a big bugbear of hers. And so it just seems like an own goal. And it seems like Labour just has one after the other here. Again, since they came in, there have been lots of little scandals like this. I mean, it's not the Tory sleaze of the 1990s, right? But it doesn't look good. We've had, even down to the ridiculous stuff like, Keir Starmer having his suits paid for, or Taylor Swift tickets, right? I think it was Darren Jones, who's on £123,000 a year, who said, oh, well, it was a nice little treat for my children, So I think it's just a build of these things in the eyes of the public that it just leaves a stench. And, we know that we already have Nigel Farage running rings around the Labour Party. Yesterday, we had Zack Polanski elected as leader of the Green Party. And now we're going to talk about that later. That's another threat. And I think that whether she survives in her position or not, it's just going to leave a stench. What people are going to remember is that the housing minister had two houses and that she didn't pay the amount of tax that she was meant to pay. And that's what people are going to remember. And that's a huge problem. So I just don't know how they get themselves into these positions, whether it's hubris or what, but it's not a good look.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's not a good look. I suppose, obviously it's a mistake. She probably should have known better, but it sounds like a stressful situation. You're breaking up with your partner, you've got kids, one of them's got learning difficulties, you're also the deputy prime minister. And that's a lot on your plate. I feel like I'm going to judge them for the things which are a bit more consequential than this. Because, there is a possibility she did it through malice because she really wanted to pay less tax. That's possible. It seems to me more like she didn't dot all the I's and cross all the T's. But again, maybe I'm being incredibly naive. You guys watching can decide. Ethiopia is the most populous landlocked country on earth. But it wasn't always that way. Between 1951 and 1993, Eritrea was in one form or another, and part of Ethiopia, meaning that the country had a long coastal region and free access to the Red Sea. But from 1961, rebel forces in Eritrea fought a 30-year war against the Ethiopian government, eventually achieving independence after the collapse of the Ethiopian government in 1991. Now, that deprived Ethiopia of its maritime access, and there are growing signs the country wants to take it back. So on Monday, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed made these comments in a televised interview. For 1,000 years, we have been unable to benefit from the Nile River and the services it should provide. Likewise, we had access to the Red Sea some 30 years ago. That presence was recent, just yesterday in historical terms. The mistake made yesterday will be corrected tomorrow, and it is not a difficult matter. We have been silent for decades, but remaining a prisoner of the land is no longer sustainable. This is not a matter of pride. It has become an existential issue. Ethiopia's current Prime Minister has long coveted access to the Red Sea. But as recently as March this year, he suggested that would only be sought via negotiation, not war. There was no such commitment on Monday, though. In response, Eritrea has accused Ethiopia of belligerence, describing the country's efforts to obtain Red Sea access as a poisonous agenda of territorial claims. And there is now a widespread fear this could lead to all-out war between the two states. If the armies of the two nations do come to blows, that would be a turnaround from the last deadly war in the region, in which Ethiopia and Eritrea fought on the same side. And that was against the Tigrayan people. Now, this 2021 report from the BBC explains how that conflict started.
From 2018, that was when Abiy Ahmed became Prime Minister, and he didn't just take the top job. Once he'd done that, he pushed a number of powerful groups out of government, and in doing so, made a lot of enemies. One of the main losers in that shift was the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF. Now, Tigray is a region in the north. It's large, home to about 7 million people, and having been pushed out of the central government, the TPLF began demanding greater autonomy for its region, and it had thousands of fighters to back up those claims. Then in November 2020, the government acted. It declared war on the TPLF, accusing it of having attacked a government military base. And at the time, this is what the Prime Minister was saying.
Their objective was clear: to make the country ungovernable by instigating clashes along ethnic and religious lines.
Initially, the Tigray forces were beaten back, but the conflict wasn't over. These pictures are from July this year. The rebels were back in control of their regional capital, Mekelle.
So that report was from 2021. The war against Tigrayan rebels lasted from 2020 to 2022. And as I say, in that war, Ethiopia and Eritrea fought on the same side. It's thought, by the way, to have been the deadliest war of the 21st century so far, killing an estimated 200,000 soldiers, nearly 500,000 civilians. And both Eritrea and Ethiopia were accused of carrying out systematic atrocities. Hundreds of thousands more Tigrayans might also have died as a result of the destruction of harvests and the blocking of humanitarian aid. So the whole affair was a stain on the governments in both Addis Ababa, which is Ethiopia's capital, and Asmara, which is the capital of Eritrea. But now Ethiopia is pointing the finger at its one-time ally, accusing Eritrea at the UN of human rights abuses in Tigray. Few doubt Eritrea is committing abuses there. They have form, of course. But given Ethiopia's government record in the region, there's suspicion this isn't really a defense of the Tigrayan people's human rights, but rather potentially a pretext for war to get that access to the Red Sea, of course. Barry, as I said at the start, we wanted to use your presence on these shows to cover stories that we might otherwise be ignoring or not feel sort of qualified to look into at depth. You lived and worked in Ethiopia between 2007 and 2012. You've followed developments in the country closely since. What should our viewers know about this story? Why does it matter?
Well, I mean, primarily it matters because the war that took place from 2020 to 2022 was massively disastrous and destructive and brutal. And the figures that you just read out are astounding. And I think that when I tell people about these figures, they're completely shocked that they didn't really hear much about this. The African Union said, I think it could be 600,000 civilians who were killed in those 2 years. I think there was a study from Ghent University that said it could be 350,000. It's really hard to get reliable information because one of the things that the government did during the conflict was to completely block access to Tigray and cut it off from the outside world. Journalists couldn't get in, aid groups couldn't get in. And, most people thought that the Ethiopian government was actually using starvation as a weapon of war, a little bit like we're seeing in Gaza today. So, it's remarkable to me that a war of that magnitude that killed so many people slipped under the international radar. With the exception of, I should mention, there was some good correspondence. Nima El-Gabir from CNN, Jamal Osman from Channel 4. But, generally it didn't get the coverage at all that it deserved. Now there's a likelihood that war is going to break out again. And this has the potential to be a bigger war. As you said, last time it was the central government in Addis Ababa versus effectively a regional government in the Tigray region, who were kind of pincered by Ethiopia on one side and Eritrea on the other, who both came in order to fight a war against them. What we could see happen now, though, is Eritrea and Ethiopia go to war themselves. The two states go back to war. And I think that if that was to happen, it could be even more destructive than it was the last time. And it could drag the whole region in. It's really, really delicate. What we've seen from 2020 to 22 was we've seen refugees from Tigray go to Sudan, go to South Sudan, because Ethiopia borders both Sudan and South Sudan, both countries that have huge problems right now. We know that Sudan is embroiled in an absolutely terrible war. And violence has started to erupt in South Sudan also between the central government and a rebel group. So we're looking at an incredibly destabilized region if this happens. You've also got Djibouti in the mix there next to Eritrea. So yeah, it's really, really dangerous. And I just think a huge number of people could be killed, and it could destabilize an incredibly important region. For a long time, Ethiopia looked like it was a coming power. When I lived there, it seemed very, very clear that it was going to achieve middle income status, that the economy was growing at an amazing clip. But it's the conflicts of the last few years that have really knocked those ambitions back. And the other thing is that Ethiopia was seen as a kind of a stabilizing force in the region. Sometimes at the behest of the West. I think, the US has always seen Ethiopia as, an ally in the region that is close to the US and that will and that will behave in a way that is in line with sort of US policy concerns in the region or security concerns in the region. So yeah, essentially, I think that if Ethiopia and Eritrea go to war again, it's going to be one of the biggest wars that we've seen potentially, certainly this century. I mean, I think you can already argue that the 2000 to 2022 war was. So imagine it's bigger than that. It's an incredibly, incredibly worrying situation.
I mean, let's talk about the Red Sea issue. I mean, if we're able to, it might be useful to get up that map again. Because as we said at the start, Ethiopia is the largest landlocked country in the world. Someone in the comments was sort of saying that's a classic pub quiz question. But it's got 132 million people. So this is showing you Tigray as well. So you've got Ethiopia, Tigray part of Ethiopia, and Eritrea. 132 million people, but no access to the sea at all. And because it's, it wants to export goods, that's problematic. Eritrea has all of that coast. And between 3.5 and 6.5 million people. Now, the reason there's a huge margin of error there is because it's a very secretive country. I don't know if you think this is reasonable, but I've sort of, in my readings, people sort of refer to it as Africa's North Korea. Maybe that's a sort of trite thing to say, I'm not sure. But what of this claim that Ethiopia make? Obviously, you can't just say, oh, I would like this and then change borders to your own desire. But is there something to the fact that this is a country of 132 million people with no sea border, Eritrea, much smaller population? In a way, it seems a bit of a basket case, sort of in terms of the government being an authoritarian government, which is constantly forcing people to join the military, doesn't have much growth because it's authoritarian, North Korea-style country. Do Ethiopia have a point, I suppose, for want of a better word?
I don't know if they have a point. I mean, they have a point in that it's incredibly significant that they don't have a coastline. I mean, like, again, we're talking about economic growth. That is something that they had that before. And I think that they know if they had that sea access, if they had a port, then, their aspirations to become a middle income country will be helped by that. But this Red Sea access has been an issue for decades. I mean, you can go back to 1991 when effectively the TPLF and the group that became the government of Eritrea overthrew a communist regime. And as part of that deal, the border of Eritrea was drawn in a way that it kept the full access to the sea, despite there being a feeling in Ethiopia at the time among many people that they should have at least a corridor to the coastline. But at the time, Eritrea and Ethiopia, the two groups who had overthrown the communist regime, they were super friendly. They were really close. And I think that they thought that would always be the case. And that, if Ethiopia wanted to access to the sea, then it could have it. But, when they went to war in 1998 to 2000, I know that as that war was kind of coming to a conclusion and a peace agreement was reached, there were very influential people in the Ethiopian government at the time who were pushing for the Ethiopian army to take Asmara, to take the capital of Eritrea, to occupy it. And one of the main arguments that they were making was so that they could access the sea. And I think that, recently when Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, and, he made this kind of tentative peace agreement with Eritrea, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way. So, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for reaching out to Eritrea in 2018, and we could be 5 minutes away from the countries going to war. A lot of people thought that when that sort of thawing in relations happened, that Ethiopia might push for at least a corridor. But I'm sort of surprised to hear him speaking in such a pub-thumping way about this. Because, like I say, a lot of Ethiopians, they're angry about that loss of access to the sea. And, I think it will be in some ways quite a popular thing for him to say. So, yeah, it's significant. But I don't think they can blame Eritrea for not giving them access right now, especially when relations were terrible for decades.
I suppose there's a broader argument I've heard about this, which is you've got a country, Ethiopia, which has had this long-term grievance and this long-term ambition to have access to the Red Sea. Doesn't seem to me that there's sort of anything in particular that's happened to sort of make it seem as if a war is now inevitable or necessary. But Ethiopia now, for some reason, seems to think it's a good time to talk this up. And one analysis here, I think, is that the fact that the Ukraine war is going on, the fact that the genocide is going on in Gaza, means that the rest of the world is somewhat distracted. So if you've got a long-term grievance and you feel like your military might have an edge, and presumably given Ethiopia's population is about 10 times bigger than Eritrea's. I know Eritrea's got sort of mandatory military service and sort of enforced conscription, so it's got a disproportionately powerful army relative to its population. But presumably Ethiopia would be the stronger country, I would imagine. If you've got this long-term grievance, you think you might have the military edge, is now the time to try and push for the change. And I suppose, if that's what lots of governments are thinking around the world, that potentially speaks to a dangerous moment in world politics. I don't know what you think about that.
I don't think it's only about the Red Sea. There's been all this strange maneuvering between, the TPLF that controls Tigray, although it has factions have broke out. But yeah, the Tigrayans, the Eritreans, and the Ethiopians have been moving against each other in all kinds of odd ways. And despite a peace agreement being signed in 2022 to end the war between Ethiopia, the Tigrayans, and the Eritrean government, it's still incredibly delicate. And now there are alliances apparently forming between the Eritreans and the Tigrayans. So I think Ethiopia is also kind of worried that if that happens, then the Tigrayans may start, or that another war may break out, and that this time Eritrea will be on the Tigrayan side. So I don't think it's necessarily only about the port, but you're absolutely right that people just aren't engaged in the Horn of Africa right now because of other conflicts around the world. The US, for example, always had a Horn of Africa envoy. And since the last one stepped down, I can't remember exactly when that was, but they haven't even appointed a new one. Like I say, this was considered an incredibly important region for the US, primarily because of security concerns. And they don't even have an envoy now. They're not even bothered to appoint an envoy. So, I think that indicates that eyes are off the Horn of Africa right now. So, yeah, you could say an opportune moment, but I think a worrying moment, really.
Important correction. I suggested that Ethiopia was the largest landlocked country. It's not the largest, it's the most populous landlocked country, and the largest, I'm I'm told by Stephen Meffin, is Kazakhstan. Is that correct? Yes, Kazakhstan is the largest. I wouldn't want to lose you any points on a pub quiz. Beijing on Wednesday was host to a massive military parade showing the strength of China's armed forces and its regional alliances. And throughout the ceremony, which was to commemorate 80 years since the defeat of Japan in the Second World War, President Xi Jinping was flanked by Vladimir Putin of Russia and Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and the leaders of Myanmar, Iran, Pakistan, Belarus, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, among others, were also present. And in terms of the arms on display, China demonstrated for the first time its capacity to launch nuclear warheads from the land, sea, and air. Hypersonic, supersonic, and autonomous weapons were also in evidence. But the most visually striking element was a huge shipborne laser. Obviously, it's on a truck there, but it can be put on a ship. That state television said would be a key part of air defences for the PLA Navy's surface fleet. Giant lasers. Drone and anti-drone gear was also seen as highlighting China's strength in technologies that could be vital in any future war over Taiwan. But in his speech, President Xi was key to put forward the message that China was interested in peace.
Today, humanity again has to choose between peace and war, dialogue and confrontation, win-win cooperation and zero-sum game. The Chinese people firmly stand on the right side of history and the progress of human civilization. We will remain committed to the path of peaceful development and join hands with all peoples around the world in building a community with a shared future for humanity.
That was Xi presenting China as a force for peace in the world. Some might suggest cozying up to Putin somewhat undermines that. But this comment in a Financial Times write-up of the parade struck me as important, actually. So it's from a professor of Chinese studies at King's College London. So it's called Kerry Brown. He says, it's all very performative talking about the parade. They can definitely march. They can put on a great parade, but they've not fought for many decades. It's a completely untested military. Now, I think that statement was supposed to show the limit of Chinese power, right? You know, these weapons might look good, but we don't know how they're actually usable in the theatre of war. But I think it also says something quite positive about China, right? It's remarkable to have this rising power that we're always told is a threat, yet whose main weakness is apparently that they haven't started enough wars. So I suppose I'd take that. Of course, that could change if China gains military dominance or greater military dominance. And some military analysts think that moment could be near. So Foreign Policy magazine today ran a piece suggesting China is now a world leader in terms of military technology. Sam Rogeveen, a former senior analyst for the Australian intelligence agency, pointed to new stealth fighters, which were first spotted last year, and whose tailless design is believed could make them harder to pick up by radar, and to the development of a unique type of powered barge with extendable road bridges that could allow vehicle-carrying ships to unload their cargo at an unprepared coastal site. So this could infuriate any invasion of Taiwan. Now, add to this the new weapon systems displayed in Beijing on Wednesday, and the author concludes this. So he says it's no longer enough to say that China's military, the People's Liberation Army, is catching up or that it is copying foreign military equipment designs. China is now innovating and it is leading. In the process, the regional military balance that has for decades favoured the United States and its partners is being irrevocably changed. The focus, though, on regional military balance is crucial for this argument, though. Rogeveen writes this, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Consider that China has not added to the single overseas base it opened in Djibouti in 2017. It is years away from fielding a bomber with intercontinental range, and it has nothing like the global alliance network of the United States. The new fighter aircraft, landing barges, drones, and missile systems that have emerged this year don't suggest an overwhelming focus on global power projection either. They will primarily strengthen China's position in its neighborhood. So he's saying, you know, if they've got a military edge, it's regional, not global. Earlier today, I spoke to William Hurst in Beijing. William is the Chonghua Professor of Chinese Development at Cambridge University. We discussed China's growing military strength and its desired place in the world. But I began by asking a question about history. I mean, how Wednesday's military parade shows how China, or to what extent it shows that China wants to reframe the history of the Second World War?
I'm not sure China's reframing the history for a domestic audience as much as it's trying to reframe a bit of it for an international audience. Domestically, it's more about underscoring a long-standing narrative about the centrality of the Second World War in shaping some of the dynamics of the Chinese Civil War and Chinese Revolution, and about the role of the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army under the party's leadership in winning the war, winning the Civil War, achieving the revolution, and crafting today's China. For an international audience, I think there is a desire on the part of the Chinese government and the party to reframe a bit of the narrative to center the role of China and the role and the importance of World War II in Asia. And there's a consistent sort of discourse coming out of official organs in China that in the West, the war in Asia is being forgotten or is not sufficiently emphasized. I'm not sure that's true, particularly in North America, but that's what they're trying to say is basically the West has forgotten World War II in Asia. We want to re-emphasize that and re-emphasize the central role of China.
I mean, I suppose it's the war in Asia is not forgotten in the United States, but it's framed as, you know, Americans fought the Japanese and then the nuclear bomb was used and then it was won. And China's saying what you've missed out is, you know, our resistance fighters and the fact that 20 million Chinese were killed. So I suppose that's where they're coming from in this perspective.
Exactly. And even the fact that the war in China started 10 years before Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about the nature of this military parade in the sense, I suppose most people, you think of a military parade, you think that must be a very militaristic country, sort of the idea that you're showing all your weaponry through the streets. I suppose China would say they haven't fought any major wars in the past 40 years. If you compare China's rise to, say, the rise of other major global powers like Britain or the United States, this is a remarkably peaceful country. And so, I mean, what do you make of the claim that this is a military parade by a remarkably peaceful state?
That is, again, certainly how the Chinese government is portraying the parade in its own media and propaganda. But I think if you look at the history of China, particularly the conquest of what's now parts of southwestern China that used to be part of different Southeast Asian states prior to about the 1400s, 1500s, maybe a little bit earlier, actually. And if you think about the dynamics in the South China Sea today, and many other sort of border disputes that China's had in even the recent history, for example, the 1962 war with India, it's not always been the case that China's been remarkably peaceful. In fact, the last significant war that China actually did fight was in 1979, when it invaded Vietnam, because Vietnam had invaded Cambodia to topple the Khmer Rouge, with whom China were aligned. So I think that there's not necessarily an entirely peaceful dynamic, and I think that many states in the region would not view China as entirely having peaceful intentions, even though it's trying to emphasize repeatedly that this is a demonstration of defensive capability.
Does that potentially underplay, though, the extent to which sort of the United States, which is often positioning China as this sort of revisionist power, has military bases all across the world? I think China has one international military base. And yeah, you have to go back quite far to sort of talk about expansion into the more western parts of China that didn't used to be a part of it. So if you're looking in the nearer term, you've got the West, which I suppose Xi Jinping and his allies would say has been constantly sort of mounting expeditionary warfares around the world. And then you've got China, which is, you know, to a greater or lesser extent, been keeping itself to itself and rising peacefully. You're quite dismissive of that narrative, though.
I wouldn't completely dismiss the narrative, nor would I underplay the extent to which Western powers were perhaps more violent and more ruthlessly expansionist at similar points in their history. But I would just emphasize, for example, the South China Sea story, in that, you know, in just the last 30 years, China has constructed artificial islands and indeed built military installations there in areas that it claims are part of its sort of inland water or internal waters or territorial waters, but which everyone else thinks of as either being international waters or in fact as being in the exclusive economic zones of Southeast Asian states like the Philippines. So from the perspective of some states, China is not peaceful and non-expansionist even now.
What's the situation? I know you're an expert when it comes to sort of the Southeast Asian states. I know Indonesia were there at this military parade. Were the Philippines not there, presumably? I mean, what is China's current relations with its regional neighbors?
It depends which ones. So I think if we look at Southeast Asia as a whole, you're talking about many different countries, there are a few states, notably Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, all of which did send high-level representatives to the parade, which have a strong positive relationship, almost to the point of dependency, with China. The rest of Southeast Asia has, to varying degrees, a degree of an amount of sort of security ambivalence, or ambivalence about China when it comes to their security, but a very strong economic relationship, and vice versa. China actually has ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as its most important and largest trading partner, and that relationship's expanding quite rapidly. So the option of delinking on the economic front isn't there for Southeast Asian countries, yet there is a great degree of concern in many countries in Southeast Asia about China as a security threat. And China perceives its security to be not entirely assured in the South China Sea and across Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of tension and a lot of different degrees of nuance there. If we think about Indonesia coming to the parade, or the president of Indonesia, actually, Prabowo Subianto, coming to the parade, the one reason why that is notable, there are the two reasons actually. One is that Indonesia historically has been among the countries that has been more ambivalent about China in security terms. And Prabowo Subianto seems to be moving towards a less ambivalent, more comfortable position in terms of the way he views China on security, at least slightly. But also Indonesia has been racked by massive protests and riots across at least 10 different cities over the last 5 or 6 days. And so in the context of this domestic political instability, Prabowo had decided, as recently as a day or two ago, that he would not come to China for the parade. He would have to stay in Indonesia to handle the crisis that's going on there. Notably because in 1998, when Suharto traveled to Egypt in the middle of a similar crisis, that's when his regime fell. So mindful of that, Prabowo did not wish to leave Indonesia at this time. He did, at the last minute, apparently find enough confidence to leave and to come to the parade. And it was announced with some fanfare on Chinese television this morning that he had landed in the early hours and made it just in time to be at the parade. And he had a televised entrance on the red carpet among the other leaders of, I think, 26 or 27 countries who came.
And from a military perspective, I know sort of part of the point of the parade was to demonstrate China's military prowess. Was there any particular types of technology that stood out to you? I suppose another argument is that this wasn't so much about saying our military is better than the Americans' military, but all of this has been made in China. So it's sort of showing off their industrial base to some extent.
There was some commentary on Chinese television after the parade that did suggest that China's military is now at least equal to any other in the world. In other words, that there's no military better than China's or stronger than China's, according to some of these analysts on Chinese television. I don't know if there's any real merit or not in such arguments, and I'm not an expert on military technology per se. But what did strike me watching the parade is that many of the formations that passed the reviewing stand were not from traditional parts of the armed forces, right? So normally you'd have the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, etc. And they did have that in large numbers. But then they also had different sort of sub-commands for different kinds of equipment. Anti-drone formation passed by with all kinds of anti-drone technology. Another cyber warfare formation. Something else about space and space militarization or weapon capacity in space. So I think there was a different organization to the way that the military presented itself in public this time, which struck me as somewhat notable. I'm less expert on, for example, some of the nuclear missiles that were displayed, again, according to Chinese television, were apparently of a new generation and better, longer range, more capable of targeting multiple targets, etc., than earlier publicly displayed Chinese missiles. But I wouldn't be able to know exactly how much that makes a difference.
I suppose most of the focus, you've talked about Indonesia and some other Southeast Asian countries, most of the focus from the West when it comes to this military parade has been Xi, Kim Jong-un, and Vladimir Putin. And I suppose I wanted to know from you, is that a particular Western focus to sort of see that triad as the key relationship here, or is that something which is also being emanated from Beijing, that this is a really important alliance between those three nations? Sorry.
China does have one alliance with North Korea. It's had that since before the Korean War. China would probably like to be free of that alliance. North Korea is always not always the best ally to be stuck with. So I would emphasize it's not an alliance per se. And China and Russia actually don't trust or like each other as much as I think a lot of observers from outside think that they do. But it was notable in all of the domestic media reports that I saw, as well as in the live broadcast, that Putin and Kim were emphasized and were given sort of pride of place in the order of precedence as everyone went in and where they sat in the reviewing stand. So, I do think that there's a strong emphasis on that. Definitely, it was notable that Kim Jong-un came, and that was also noted by a number of observers and commentators, both inside China and outside, because he often would not come for these days. He travels abroad quite seldom. So I think there was an emphasis on that, definitely. And certainly there's an attempt by China to make sure that Russia is supported sufficiently and is sufficiently able to survive the war in Ukraine that it started, as well as other situations around the world that Russia finds itself confronted with, so as to still be able to balance the United States and Japan, right? And more notable, I think, than what happened at the parade, in fact, was that Modi attended the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin over the past weekend. And there was given quite a warm reception. So China and India historically have had quite a bad relationship. They've gone to war in 1962, and since then there have been skirmishes on the border as recently as just a few years ago, just during COVID, I believe it was, that this was still happening on the border. And since the Ukraine war, there's been a concerted effort, I think, by China to kind of bring India back in from the cold, in large part because the concern historically had always been India's moving too close to Russia, and China and Russia had a bad relationship, or the Soviet Union before Russia even. And so it was important to try to weaken India to make sure that Russia would not be able to sort of flank China from both north and south. Today, with Russia under threat and in a potentially weak position, and India threatening basically to move closer to the West, the concern since the start of the Ukraine war especially has been to make sure India does not feel obliged to move too close to the West and stays close with Russia and helps support Russia, again, to keep balancing the US and Japan and to a lesser extent Europe. So Modi coming was even more notable, I think, than Kim Jong-un coming. And the reception that Modi received was, I think, deliberately very positive and warm.
And I suppose, I mean, is a crude reading. So Modi turns up to the summit, which was mainly about economic cooperation, but he doesn't turn up to the military parade. Can we sort of say India and China are economic allies, but still military rivals? I mean, obviously, I'm simplifying here, but is there something to that?
I think that would have been a step too far, perhaps, to actually show up and be seated at the parade. Remember, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization actually at base is really about counterterrorism and security rather than economic. They're trying to shift the focus more towards economics, but basically it's a security framework from its inception. It's notable because it includes a wide variety of states that don't always see eye to eye on security issues, not least both India and China. But yes, I do think the fact that he didn't stay and go to the parade is probably a statement that he's not comfortable getting that close to China. I think China would have been very happy to have Modi at the parade. but I think he would have seen it as a bridge too far.
That was William Hurst speaking to me earlier today. Now, before we go on to our next story, you may or may not know, I don't know why you wouldn't, but if you don't, Ash Sarkar, with the occasional backup from our editor Stephen Meffan, has been writing and sending out a newsletter every week for, well, years, absolutely years. You've got no excuse whatsoever. The Cortado is our most popular newsletter, delivering an exclusive take straight into your inbox, plus a curation of Novara's best content from across the organisation. You can sign up at novaramedia.com/thecortado. Zack Polanski has been all across the media since becoming leader of the Green Party on Tuesday, and he probably got the most hostile hearing from Ed Balls on Good Morning Britain. He and Susanna Reid spent a while grilling Polanski about a 12-year-old son article involving hypnotherapy and breast enlargement. But Balls went on to say this.
But on the climate, would you rather have a Labour government or a Conservative
I'd rather have a Labour government, but a Labour government is not enough. And actually, when you have a climate crisis, it's not enough to have a gold star.
You rather gave the impression that Keir Starmer was basically a Tory. They're all the same. But you've now told us that you'd rather have a Labour government than a Conservative government. And so I'm just trying to understand that contradiction.
I think there's a much more fundamental question, which are the Labour government doing enough to tackle the climate crisis? Fundamentally, no, they're not. Are they better than the Conservative government? Yes, marginally, but I'm not interested in better.
So if you've got a Labour
doing the right thing.
If you've got a Labour Conservative marginal seat, would you tell your candidate not to stand because it's better that Labour win than the Conservatives win for the climate? Or would you say it's OK if a Green candidate stands, takes votes from Labour, and the Tories get in?
I want to see every Labour politician who's voted for a two-child benefit cap, for disability cuts, for the ongoing genocide in Gaza to sell arms to them.
Even if that's worse for the environment, that's OK. You're the Green Party leader, but you would have a worse Green outcome for these other issues.
I don't think people like being held hostage like that. And if the Labour government want to bring in proportional representation so that every vote counts equally...
It's called voting.
Well, it's not called voting if it's a broken voting system. And if the Labour Party are keeping that same broken voting system, despite the fact your members and the unions are saying we want a fair voting system,
the next election is going to be first past the post. Are you going to say to people... Yeah, it will be.
Well, then I think if it's still first past the post, there's no way Keir Starmer can say it's me or Nigel Farage, because he's the person who has kept that broken voting system in place. If we want better politics, it's time to have a better voting system.
Now, remember, Ed Balls is the husband of Yvette Cooper, who is the current Home Secretary. And he's putting to Zack Polanski. Actually, I watched the whole interview. The first bit of it was about the hypnosis boob story. The huge middle chunk was about, well, are you worried that if people vote for you, they're not going to vote for Labour and then the Tories will get in or Reform will get in, whatever. There was no real debate about any of the substantive issues, which made it seem to me like they are a little bit shook because they weren't going after him on any of the things he was actually saying. And I mean, I've said this a few times on the show before, but I mean, I do think there is a possible world in which, you have a Keir Starmer government. He's not, particularly left-wing, but he's sort of social democratic. He is improving public services. He is taxing the rich a bit, maybe not as much as me or you might like, but, he's sort of doing a decent job. And that then if you said, well, he's not left-wing enough, so let's stand against him and allow reform in, that argument would have held, and what Ed Balls was saying might have seemed a bit more reasonable. But the fact is, since Keir Starmer has come into government, all he said is, I hate left-wing people and I love flags. Like, that's it. And so there's no reason to sort of, it's just implausible to say that anyone standing against Labour is being some sort of ideological fanatic splitter, because Keir Starmer has so clearly made absolutely no attempt whatsoever to try and get left-wing people to vote for him. If Keir Starmer's message had been, look, I want this to be a big, broad tent, yeah, no one's going to be happy with everything I do. I've got some things for the left, I've got some things for the centre, I've got some things for social conservatives, but hopefully you can all be part of this project. Then, yeah, maybe what Ed Balls was saying to Zack Polanski would have been remotely plausible. But in the actual world in which we actually live, it's not. Barry, what did you think of, I suppose, Zack Polanski's first 24 hours as leader of the Greens?
Firstly, I thought that interview was completely absurd, just absurd. And for me, it points to a media in the UK that is often just completely unserious when it comes to, its political coverage. I think he spent 4 minutes talking about the boobs story, before he even moved on to that next rant about, running against Labour candidates. And I just find that, when Ed Balls interviews people from the left on Good Morning Britain, there's a sort of a disdain comes off him. I'm hugely in favor of tough interviews, and I wish journalists would interview people even tougher. But it's just this odd disdain. And, I found that whole line of questioning also ridiculous. It was almost like, how dare you run against the Labour Party? We have a two-party system here. It works pretty fine. Like, who do you think you are to come along and put a cat among the pigeons? I think it's just demeaning, and it's disrespectful of the British public and, of people who are looking for, a different kind of politics. And as you said, they never really spoke about any substantive issues, despite Zack Polanski trying many, many times to do so. I honestly think in the last 24 hours, what's become clear is that Labour are running scared. I mean, the Labour press office, sent out this tweet again about the absurd boobs thing. And I just had this vision, like it came out as soon as he was elected. And I just had this vision of them having it ready and thinking, okay, guys, get it out there. We're going to get him with this. And then he just came back with this brilliant retort, which was like, yes, I did something 12 years ago that I've said sorry for, but I'm not supporting a genocide. And, so I think they're going to have to be really careful with Zack Polanski, because I think he's sharp. And, what they've shown is that these attacks in the last couple of days have been sort of toothless. There was another one on Twitter where, an influencer said, oh, the Greens have elected a white man as their leader. How revolutionary, which, again, people just thought was a ridiculous allegation. So, I think what's become apparent in the last 24 hours is that Labour is really, really running scared. Now they don't just have this threat from the right with reform, but they have a threat from the left with, I think, a party that if he gets the chance to put his policies forward, if he doesn't have to continually deal with absurd interviews like that, I think his policies will be popular with the British public.
And he is quite good at dealing with absurd interviews, actually. It's quite, nice to see someone on the left who feels, or who seems quite comfortable, sort of getting an interview back on track.
You can calm right down. I will calm right down, but if you cuff me, I swear to God, I'll be a problem. You don't cuff me. For standing up for women's rights, don't cuff me.
That was audio from the arrest of Father Ted co-creator and somewhat obsessive anti-trans activist Graham Linehan on Monday morning. The arrest took place at Heathrow Airport after Linehan stepped off a flight from Arizona in the United States. He says he was taken to a police cell, interviewed, and then released on bail with only one condition: no more posting on X. In a statement, the Metropolitan Police gave some of Linehan's posts on social media as the reason for the arrest, saying this: the man in his 50s was arrested on suspicion of inciting violence. This is in relation to posts on X. He has now been bailed pending further investigation. Now, the police haven't said what posts triggered the arrest, but Linehan has said it relates to 3 posts from April this year. So the first 2 are from the 19th of April. One is a photo of a rally in support of trans rights that took place in Brighton in the spring with the caption, "A photo you can smell." Then in response to a comment on that first post, Linehan said, "I hate them, misogynists and homophobes. Fuck them." The third post was published the next day with Linehan saying this: if a trans-identified male is in a female-only space, he is committing a violent, abusive act. Make a scene, call the cops, and if all else fails, punch him in the balls. Now, we only have Linehan's words that these were the posts behind his arrest. The police haven't confirmed this. I mean, my own personal opinion is that the first 2 tweets are very different from the third tweet. So the first 2 tweets were rude. The third tweet is incitement. Whether or not that warrants an arrest is a question we'll discuss. Linehan, for his part, also says it wasn't just a couple of bobbies waiting for him at the airport, but 5 armed police officers. To many, even those who deplore Linehan's views, the whole episode did strike one as overkill. Now, one of those people who thinks that this was inappropriate behaviour from the police, or at least from sort of law enforcement in general, was Mark Rowley, Met Commissioner. He's released a statement saying this: while the decision to investigate and ultimately arrest the man was made within existing legislation, which dictates that a threat to punch someone from a protected group could be an offence, I understand the concern caused by such incidents given differing perspectives on the balance between free speech and the risks of inciting violence in the real world. Most reasonable people would agree that genuine threats of physical violence against an identified person or group should be acted upon by officers. Such actions can and do have serious and violent real-world implications. But when it comes to lesser cases, where there is ambiguity in terms of intent and harm, policing has been left between a rock and a hard place by successive governments who have given officers no choice but to record such incidents as crimes when they're reported. Then they are obliged to follow all lines of inquiry and take action as appropriate. He says, I don't believe we should be policing toxic culture wars, debates, and officers are currently in an impossible position. I have offered to provide suggestions to the Home Office on where the law and policy should be clarified. Greater clarity and common sense would enable us to limit the resources we dedicate to tackling online statements to those cases creating real threats in the real world. If agreed, we could be ready to test new approaches quickly within a matter of weeks. As an immediate way of protecting our officers from the situation we find ourselves in today, we will be putting in place a more stringent triaging process to make sure only the most serious cases are taken forward in future where there is a clear risk of harm or disorder. I suppose it's that clear risk of harm or disorder that probably wasn't there, I would imagine, in the case of Linehan. The Met Police have now dropped their investigation into Graham Linehan, and Health Secretary Wes Streeting sided with Mark Rowley on the Today programme.
As the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have been clear, we want the police to focus on policing streets rather than tweets. And it's very easy for people to criticise the police, but the thing that we are always mindful of as a government that backs the police to keep us safe, that the police are there to enforce the laws that we as Parliament legislate for. So if over the years, with good intentions, Parliament has layered more and more expectation on the police and diluted the focus and priorities of the public, that is obviously something that we need to look at. When it comes to speech,
what about, things like
when it
speech
comes to speech, context is king. And we do have to, I think, as legislators, tread really carefully when it comes to boundaries of free speech.
Linehan's arrest has been fodder for some powerful people with an interest in installing a right-wing government in the UK, quote tweeting J.K. Rowling, asking, what the fuck has the UK become? This is totalitarianism. So that's what J.K. Rowling said. Elon Musk retweets saying, police state, 11 million views. Writer Nasha Walter made this point. I see a massive outcry here about the arrest of Graham Linehan. Fair enough, it seems absurd and authoritarian. I'm not seeing so much of an outcry, though, about the arrests of Tim Crosland and Paddy Friend of Defend Our Juries. These arrests are also absurd and authoritarian. That's a reference to the arrest of 7 Defend Our Juries spokespeople on Tuesday by counter-terror police, who accused them of being in breach of the Terrorism Act for organising Zoom calls to protest the prescription of Palestine action. Linehan has now said he intends to sue the Met Police for wrongful arrest, false imprisonment, and breaches of his free speech rights. Barry, what do you make of this? I suppose I'm just going to reread the one tweet that I do think is probably, it probably should be criminal, but also is it a useful use of police time? Because obviously there are lots of crimes that aren't investigated, and maybe, but if a trans-identified male is in a female-only space, he is committing a violent, abusive act, make a scene, call the cops, and if all else fails, punch him in the balls. That is incitement, but whether it warrants 5 armed police at an airport is a somewhat different matter. What's your take on this?
First of all, I should admit I have some skin in the game here because Linehan has gone after me on Twitter quite a lot over the last few weeks. So, I make sure I'm not going to be biased here. But the tweet is absolutely reprehensible. It's a disgusting tweet, and it could be construed as an incitement to violence, I guess. He says it was a joke, something to do with height disparity. I mean, God, this guy used to be one of the best comedy writers in the world, and this is the level of his stuff now. But I am probably going to be really unpopular here because I do think that it was an overstep I think he was arrested under the Public Order Act. It seems kind of absurd to me. The fact that 5 police turned up at the airport seems kind of absurd to me. The fact that he has claimed that they were armed, again, seems kind of absurd. And it does seem to me like a waste of police time. I do want to say that it is galling to hear Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting talking today about overzealous policing, after proscribing a protest group protesting a genocide and arresting, pensioners for holding up placards, really galling to hear them talk like that today. But again, I think that we need to be careful of abusing legislation. Clearly the anti-terror legislation has been abused to prescribe Palestine action. And I want to say that's obviously a much more egregious and serious and consequential case than this storm in a teacup. But also I think that we are in danger of using legislation legislation in a political manner, making complaints to the police about people who you disagree with, terminally online culture wars, resulting in police going and knocking on people's doors or wasting their time turning up at an airport. Really, you said it earlier, but I'm glad that maybe they've done him a favor by banning him from Twitter for a while, and he can go out there and, like the young people say, touch grass. Maybe with the likes of Linehan, what the police should be doing is taking them out for a walk in a forest, and instead of, arresting them for these absurd tweets. So yeah, it's completely reprehensible. And I think, every day he's out there on Twitter attacking people in a really bigoted manner. But was an arrest the appropriate response for this tweet? I'm not sure.
I mean, I'm pretty much with you on that front, although I do think that tweet is very much borderline as to whether or not that should be illegal or not. It doesn't strike me as a sort of First Amendment. That's just an opinion. I hadn't sort of clocked that was supposed to be a joke about height differentials. Anyway, we'll end it there. Barry Malone, great to have you back on. I really enjoyed our conversation about Ethiopia. I'm looking forward to going through more of these stories that I don't know so much about.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.